you will open up your Bibles to the book that's mentioned on the screen there, Ecclesiastes. It's a very small little book. It probably only takes about 8 pages in your Bible. In fact, I can't find it right now. Where'd it go? But this table of contents at the beginning of the Bible, if you need to use that, which I might need to use that right now. There we go, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. Right after Proverbs, the book of Ecclesiastes. It's good to be back with you all this evening. It actually feels kind of strange. It feels like Sunday morning, and it's like 5 in the afternoon. But I had a wonderful visit up there at Hackman Road, and then but it also caused me another problem of I don't know how to intro my sermon without making some joke about Chuck's sermon this morning. So I didn't have the live stream or any recording of it, so we'll just have to launch right into this sermon tonight. But the book of Ecclesiastes, what we're going to do is we're going to mainly just sit in this book, just kind of do a flyover of it, and kind of hit on the main points and themes. And it's really just so that whenever you encounter this book or dive into it on your own, you can maybe have a launching point to go at in studying it. Because it's kind of a weird one. It doesn't have a very linear flow of thought. It's not telling a story. That goes to the very first point I have on here, which is the book of Ecclesiastes. It's just a very strange little book. It serves a negative role in the Bible because it sits among the books of wisdom, the wisdom literature books, which, if you think about, this is a kind of a subgroup of a subgroup. We have our books of poetry, which is Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. And then within that is these 3 books of wisdom, which is Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. And they're all kind of united in themes, and they're all kind of trying to communicate the wisdom of God to us, which all books of the Bible do that. But these specifically are little think tanks. Each of them are coming at a different perspective of how to live in wisdom in God's world. And so the way that I've heard Ecclesiastes described to me, which I want to explain this to you all real quick before we launch into it, is Ecclesiastes is almost like a rebuttal of Proverbs. So within those 3 books, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Job, Proverbs is this book that tells you, well, if you live righteously, then you will have abundance, and if you prepare, then you'll have blessing in time of loss, and if you're a wicked and foolish person, well, then you're going to fall. If you're prideful, then pride comes before the fall. And it's just all these different types of just almost formulaic. If you do this, then therefore this is what the outcome will be. And it's it's wisdom and it's truth and it's good. But then Ecclesiastes comes along, and it's almost more like a skeptic, walks up and he kind of scrunches his nose, squints his eyes, and he just looks at Proverbs and he's like, is it though? Is it like that? He's like, I've seen the battle not always go to the strong, and the race doesn't always go to the swift. And then it's like these 2 opposites that talk to each other, and we're supposed to take them now and compare them, and then we try to find the wisdom in between these 2 books as we harmonize them together. And so, for instance, in Proverbs, a couple of examples here on the screen of these statements that are just made, that are true wisdom proverbs, but they're not promises. It's something we have to keep in mind. Proverbs 22 and verse 6. That's train up in a child in the way they will go, and when they're old, they will not depart from it. But I know people, I've grown up with people who now, they don't live in the way that they were trained up in. What do you make of that? Why does that happen? Proverbs 3, verse 5 through 8. That's, why don't we just read it? Proverbs 3, 5 through 8, real quick. It says, trust in Yahweh with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge of him, and he will make your path straight. Don't be wise in your own eyes. Fear Yahweh and turn away from evil. And then all true. And then verse 8 says it will be healing to your body and refreshment to your bones. But does that literally happen every single time? Often, following the Lord is actually very hard, and it doesn't feel like a very straight path. It kind of feels like you're wandering around. And so this is what wisdom is. Wisdom is seeing 2 pathways and then finding the narrow way in between and recognizing that the world is complex. And these 2 books, they present that for us. And specifically what Ecclesiastes is doing is he's just going to completely extinguish all of our expectations. He's going to put a wet blanket over it and just like totally just tear us down. Totally to tear us down, to see what we're truly made of, obliterating every illusion that we could possibly have. And then it's all in to see like what's at our core. Like what are we building our lives on? What are we trying to say about the way that we live? But then as we tear it down, as he obliterates every illusion, it's hopefully to build something better. Like sometimes you have to burn something down to its roots to see what its foundation is, and then from there, build up once again. The book of Ecclesiastes is attributed to Solomon. His name isn't actually used in the book. But if you open up, now if you will, go to Ecclesiastes chapter 1, please. Ecclesiastes 1. We're going to look at just 3 main concepts that he introduces here in just the first 15 verses that are littered throughout the rest of the book. And in verse 1, it says, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. And so the word preacher there, I don't know if all of our translations are the same. I forgot to look at that. But it just means the person who addresses a crowd. Ecclesiastes, it comes from the same word that the word church does, ecclesia, or group of people. And so it's the one who speaks to the assembly. And he has 3 main points here in Ecclesiastes 1. So the first thing that he talks about is what we see in verse 2. Look down at verse 2. He says, vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Everything is vanity. Vanity of vanities. And so first off, that word there, vanity. I think it's in the New King James. I might be wrong there. But one of them has the word meaningless or vanity. For the most part, those are the 2 words that will be translated. In Hebrew, it's the word hevel. And most literally, that word hevel means smoke. And so let's just think about that for a second. So what exactly, like when you think about smoke, is it truly like not there? Like it's something's there. Like if you look at a campfire or like you're burning rubber or something, you have this massive like plume of smoke. But then when you try and like grasp at it, it just like kind of slips through your fingers, or it just dissipates. Like he's trying to come across not exactly as, well, because the word vanity there, at first that's the other thing that was kind of confusing for me, because when I looked up the word vanity and I was diving into this, I only got pictures of like a place where women do their makeup. And that's not what's being communicated here by any stretch of the means. I think, and I don't know, that made me think of the word vanity. I think I've only ever heard my grandmother use that. But it's like, what he's talking about here is he's using the word in 2 ways in this book. The first is in the idea of fleeting. So think about that idea of smoke. You see it like go all the way up. It might even stretch, like if it's a big fire, it stretches all the way into the sky, and then just like dissipates. It's fleeting. It's temporary. In Ecclesiastes 3, we'll just look at an example here. 3 verse 19, he says, for the fate of the sons of men are the same fate as the beast. It's all the same for each of them. So one dies, so does the other. And they all have the same breath, and there's no advantage for man over beast, for it's all vanity. It's all heaven. It's just fleeting. And then towards the very end of the book, in chapter 11, verse 10, he says, so remove vexation from your heart and put away evil from your flesh, because childhood and the pride of life are vanity. They're heaven. They're fleeting. They're just things that are passing away. And so that's the one use of that word there, the word hevel. He's talking about it as like smoke. It's just dissipating. It's fleeting. Can't grasp it. He also uses, this one's a little more different, is that idea of smoke looks like something, like it looks like something very tangible. You try and touch it, and it's not actually there. Like it'll just vanish out of your hands. So it's like smoke is like it's puzzling. It's like a paradox. It's not actually something you can obtain. And so if you will, look over at chapter 6. That's how he uses this word, hevel. He says that in chapter 6, verse 1 and 2, he says, there's an evil which I have seen under the sun, and that is prevalent among men. He says, a man whom God gives riches and wealth and honor, so that his soul lacks nothing of all he desires, yet God does not empower him to eat of them, for a foreigner eats of them. This is vanity and a sickening evil. So it's like this man works and works and he produces lots of good things, but then someone else benefits from it and gets the profit and he gets nothing. And he's like, doesn't make any sense. It's puzzling. It's hevel. It's hevel. It's just smoke. And then a few more pages over, if you just turn the page to chapter 8, verse 14, it says, there is a vanity which is done in the earth. That is, there are righteous men to whom it happens according to the works of wicked men. And then on the other hand, the wicked men of whom it happens according to the works of the righteous. He says, I say this too is hevel, is smoke. It's like sometimes there's a good guy, and then what happens to him is what should happen to a bad guy, and then there's a bad guy, and what should happen to him is what happens to a good guy. And he's like, it doesn't make any sense. Why? And that's what he's puzzling. That's what is the preacher's trying to think out in Ecclesiastes is what's the point of life if it's all such smoke and mirrors, if you will. And so that's the first main theme of the book is this word hevel, this fleeting, puzzling way that life is. Secondly is the phrase grasping at the wind. If you will, go down and back to chapter 1. Sorry, I had y'all turn away from there. But if you will go back to chapter 1, he says in verse 12, says, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I gave my heart to seek, to explore by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. It is a grievous endeavor which God has given the sons of men, which they should occupy themselves. Behold, I have seen all the works which are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after the wind. What is bent cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. And so this phrase there, striving after the wind, it's kind of like that image of the smoke. It's like, have you ever tried to, whenever we opened the doors the other night, when there was a huge storm blowing through, did anybody catch that wind? Is anyone able to, grab hold of it? Could anyone actually trap it within their hands? It's insanity to think that you could go down to Fenton where there was some tornado blowing through and just capture that thing in your hands. It's foolishness. It's just fleeting. It's vanity and striving after the wind. He often couples those phrases together. And then lastly, the theme I want to look at is the other one we read in that verse, which is under the sun. And this is important to remember because this reaches the limitations of his thinking because it's his control group. Like anyone who's doing a research of some sort, they have a control group. They have a group of subjects that they're testing on, and that's what they're looking at. His control group, the entire cosmos, everything under the sun. But that's limited. That is a limited point of view because what's under the sun is not everything there is. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Everything that you read about in this book is playing with the idea that 60 to 80 years, it's all you got. That's it. Once this life is over, you're done. So what's the meaning? How do you live in this life if it's all just smoke? It's all just grasping after that fleetingness, and it's all just vanity. Hevel. How do you deal with life? That's what the preacher is thinking out in this. And so what's he going to do? He's going to walk us through different types of illusions that we have, different things that we think is something. We look at it and it looks like smoke is there, but then once we actually dive into it, it's just an illusion. It's just a false grounding that we put ourselves in. So, 3 different illusions that the preacher tears down. First one is the illusion of our expectations. Expectations are so puzzling. Someone once told me that expectations are premeditated disappointments. And I was like, so far, that one's played out to be pretty true. Not to be pessimistic, but it's kind of like if I'm going into a situation and I have a certain set of things in my mind that I expect to happen from this new job or this new relationship, and that can get really bad, or this, event, whatever thing, this trip that I'm going on, whatever. Whenever I go in with a set of expectations, it's very hard because often we carry those with us into whatever, and we don't even realize it until they vanish, until they disappear, until our expectations aren't met. Because it's hard for us to see that until they're utterly ruined. And so they can happen on a small scale. What happened the other day to me, and I should have written it down. This is silly example. I was hungry after a run, so I go to Wawa because I know they had brisket tacos. And then when I got there, they said, sorry, we stopped serving those past 6 o'clock. And I was like, man, it's a bummer. I went in there looking for something, and it was just an illusion of expectation. And I was really looking forward to a brisket taco. So instead, I got the bacon lettuce wrap. Anyways, but what happens is that was like this moment where what I was walking into that situation, and I had hopes and dreams of something, and it was immediately snatched away. But this can also happen like on a massive scale. Like, I mean, who hasn't been walking along some path, some journey, and then suddenly everything's just flipped? Like, I had this whole story laid out that I was going to live into, and then that person like wants to break up with you, or the marriage falls apart, or your child decides that they're going to like move out and disown you. Like, what happens? What is life about in those moments? Like, how do you deal with those things whenever your expectations of this life are just completely just come tumbling down? It's smoke. It's heaven. It doesn't make sense. And so that's number one, the illusion of our expectations, that he's just ripping it apart. And so, welcome to Kirkwood, where it's bright and shiny all the time. I actually was thinking about this lesson. I wanted to save it for springtime so that it wasn't in the dark, cold winter, because you don't want to read this book on a rainy day. It's not a very uplifting book. Like I said, it serves a negative role. But this illusion of our expectations, that's number one. Number two, the illusion of created meaning. Because as we walk through life, the preacher wants us to get very clear in our minds that we cannot make our own meaning in this life. Look down again in verse 12. We'll read this again because I want to hone in on what he was saying around that idea of under the sun and grasping at the wind. Because notice what he says in verse 12 of Ecclesiastes chapter 1. He says, I, the preacher, have been king of Jerusalem. He says, I gave in my heart, seek and explore wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. And he says, like, it's a grievous endeavor which God has given the sons of men to occupy themselves. Because he says, I've seen all the works. Like he's gone down every road you could possibly travel, followed everything to the fullest extent, working, building up cool things, like building his kingdom, going after relationships, love, going after money and prosperity. And then he says, and behold, it's all vanity. It's all heaven. It's all striving after the wind. It's like something bent that cannot be straightened. Verse 15. And he's like, it's something that's lacking that I can't count. Like, that's such an interesting little turn of phrase there. It's like, how do you count something that you don't have? It's heaven. It doesn't make any sense. And so we can do this, like we can try to create meaning out of some of the things I've already mentioned, of work, family, money, relationships. And then, but he just says at the end of the day, like, what are you working for? What are you doing this for? Like, if we follow all these things to the end of the road, like, what is it? How does it all end? Like, the life always ends. Like, Monday always comes. That's just what happens. And as a kind of silly example of this, because I was thinking about just like how at the end of the day, like all these things like will end. I was thinking back to a time. It was actually on a winter day when me and a friend of mine, and this was like in like 5th grade. It was one of those days where it was a random like 80-degree day in the middle of February. So me and my friend are like I think we were literally like 3rd or 4th grade. And we go down to this creek, and to call it a creek is a bit much. It's more of like a drainage ditch. We begin to build a dam out of rocks. And we like construct this thing. We get all the rocks in the right place. And like we did a lot. Like we spent hours down there. We were like playing in the creek, and it was warm and it was wonderful. And wow, that photo's so bad. This was taken on like an iPhone -2 or something. But if you can see, man, wow, that looks even worse on the projector. But anyways, it was this tiny creek that just like was a trickle. It was a drainage ditch. And we built all this. We spent hours working on this. We actually dug, I can't remember which ones I have on here. Oh yeah, we found a piece of rebar. You can't really see it, but it was holding up. We made it like this thing was solid. It was extremely impressive. Like I should have been an engineer basically. But anyways, as we dug trenches along the side and we made like dikes where that we could take this toy boat and like flood it up and then release it so that it traveled down the rest of the creek. I mean, like we were going to town on it. And I was looking at this. I still have those Crocs. I literally was wearing those yesterday. Anyways, but whatever. And then that's me in the jorts right there pushing the boat down our little trenches. But the point of this is and we called it Crawfish Dam because we found this massive crawdad there. But anyways, it's a very silly example. But as we were I spent a lot of time upkeeping this thing because my friend left. This was in my backyard. My friend had to go home and I would update him at school and tell him about it. I would go out there in the freezing cold, when the cold snapped again, and my hands would be numb, trying to make sure these rocks were all in place and the dam was still working. Then ironically enough, it was actually a major tornado outbreak, one of those only every 40 years type of storms that blew through. And I went down to the creek the next day after these rains, hoping to find my great creation and my friends, all the work we had put into it. You would not even have known it was there. It was gone. The creek, it was a drainage ditch. So it was built to make sure water flowed in case of excess rain. And it flooded that day. And there was nothing left. It was absolutely destroyed. And the thing is at the end of the day, with all of the things we try to construct and we put all of our time to what end? To what end are we aiming for? If it's just about this life, if it's just about what I get out of it, it's no different than me and my friend in 4th grade building a dam in our little drainage ditch. It's just going to be completely swept away, and no one will ever know it had been there. And that's how this life is on a little micro scale, if all that we have is under the sun. And so the illusion of expectations, the illusion of creative meaning, and then finally, along with all these, they all kind of weave in and out of each other. He talks about the illusion of control that he wants to rip us down. Because we truly have zero control of our environments that we are surrounded in. The only thing we and I put in parentheses maybe, kind of jokingly, I believe fully in free will. That's not what I'm saying. But we only have control of ourselves. And then sometimes, I even do things that I don't want to do. And I act in ways that I know I shouldn't act. And so it's this idea that we have is we have complete control of our lives. I was thinking about this lesson, as I was driving. I've mentioned before, I have no idea how the engine of my car works. But I hop in and I crank it up it's bright as rain. And then I go and I drive on a road with a ton of other people. And all of those people have an iPhone in their car, I know. And all of those people are trying to go somewhere, and all those people are probably distracted in some other way. And I have zero control of how anyone else is going to drive their car. And I just hop in the car and with an engine, I have no idea how it functions, but it's extremely complex. And then I just go somewhere. If you just sit in that and kind of try and break it down, it kind of it starts to almost make you stress out about even driving from point A to point B. But in the end of the day, that's kind of the same thing of how we live our lives. I can't look at people and my surroundings and my relationships and what I'm doing here working at Kirkwood and have this idea that I control everything and everyone in my life. Because if I do, it's an illusion. That's not how it works. And if I suddenly place all my hopes on my expectations of the outcome of the situation that I think I control, then I'm doomed for it just to be obliterated and for my entire life to just be in shambles. That's where these roads end, and that's where the Ecclesiastes writer is taking us. That's where the preacher wants us to consider what are we actually building our lives on? What are we actually headed towards? But, of course, as you read through the book, you'll notice a surprising conclusion that he comes to. And if you will, we're going to do a quick kind of fly through. We're not going to hit every one of these passages here. but I do want to just start with the first three. Because each one of these times where he's been going on this tirade about how life is all hevel, and smoke, and it's meaningless, and it doesn't make any sense, and all this happens. Look at chapter 2. Chapter 2, verse 18. He's like, I hated the fruit of my labor, for which I labored under the sun, for I must leave it to the man who comes after me. And who knows whether he will be a wise man or a man of simple-minded folly. Yet he will have power over all the fruit of my labor, for which I labored, and for which I have acted wisely under the sun. He's like, this too is vanity, hevel, smoke, grasping after the wind. So therefore I turned my heart to despair for all my labor, which I had labored under the sun. But then look at how his mood shifts in verse 24. He says, therefore, there's nothing better for a man to do than to eat, to drink, and to have his soul see good in his labor. This, I've seen, is from the hand of God. And then turn over a page to chapter 3. Chapter 3, verse 19. We read this a minute ago. He says, for the fate of the sons of men, he's like, is the fate of the beast, and the same is each of them. He's like, one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath. There's no advantage for man over beast, for all is vanity. They all go to the same place. All came from dust, and to dust all return. For who knows if the breath of a man descends upward, and the breath of the beast descends down towards the earth. And so therefore, in verse 22, what's his conclusion? He says, I've seen nothing better than a man should be glad in his works, for that is his portion. For who will bring him to see what end will occur after him? And then keep reading in chapter, I think I skipped over one. Anyways, turn over to chapter 5, and we'll look at this one lastly of this little example here. Because it starts to sound extremely like pessimistic, and he actually starts to sound like the book of Job here. He says in chapter 5, verse 15, he says, as for he had come naked from his mother's womb, and so he will return as he came. He will carry nothing from the fruit of his labor that can bring back into the hand. He said, this is a sickening evil. Exactly as a man came, so he will go. So what advantage does he have as he labors after the men? And then he says, verse 20, for he will not remember the days of his life, because God allows him to occupy himself with the gladness of his heart. So you'll see this like kind of puzzling conundrum. It's like we're going along. He's like, it's all just smoke and meaningless and confusing. And then he's like, well, enjoy your life. He's like, have a good meal. Like, sit down and enjoy your youth. He's like, it's just like suddenly this switch of gears. And so like, what's going on here, Solomon? Like, you have had one too many women in your life kind of thing. Like, he's just had like, drove him crazy. Like, he's gone wild. But what is actually happening here? Because it's just like one moment, he's like a nihilistic pessimist. And then the next moment, he's optimistic and has a positive outlook on this life. So what is it? I believe it goes back to kind of how I introduced this. Is we often think of the world as just this black and white dichotomy. But he kind of sees that there's like how we see the world, there's only two options. You got to be a starry-eyed optimist or black-hearted pessimist. Like there's no in-between at all. But what the preacher says, what he sees in this life is that these moments where everything seems like smoke, like heaven, it's like he actually sees it as an opportunity. These failures, these moments where everything comes crashing down is actually a moment to appreciate like what you do have in life and to see what the big picture of everything really is. Because when we look at these moments where everything just, it's like the illusion's taken away and we realize our foundations are built in the sand, we truly have no control. We can then live peacefully in the present. Okay, and so this is one of those things where I was thinking about it and kind of like grasped it, and so I just, like, bear with me as I try to explain it. Because most of the time when someone's in one of those moments where you have everything, the rug swept out from under you, and you look around and you see things and you're like, man, well, it's because like all the good stuff's taken away where everything's just pessimistic now. But what he sees is like, well, you had the good things. And he looks at the moments where life is dark and everything, the rug is swept out from under you, happens to everyone, and that's obvious. So suddenly those moments where I actually have a good thing, and I have blessing, and I have provision, like it's a gift. Like life is a gift from the hand of God. It's himself. And it's just living presently in those moments, because often we're so distracted by the future, or something that happened in the past, that the only times we live in the present is to think about future plans or to reflect on past ones. And that's what he's trying to disconnect us from. Sufficient, as someone said, somewhere in the Bible, sufficient is the day in its trouble. Live present, in the words of Jesus. And so, as in the heart of the book, he comes to this metaphor. If you will, turn to chapter 4. There's this metaphor. It's like a little puzzle, a little riddle. And I've talked about it before, but repetition is good. It's how you learn. It's this little bit here in chapter 4, verses 4 through 6. We'll read it really quick. Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 4 through 6. He says, "For I've seen that every labor and every success of the work is the result of jealousy between a man and his neighbor. This too is vanity, hevel, striving after the wind." Now 5 and 6 is what I want to hone in on. He says, "The fool folds his hands in embrace and consumes his own flesh. One handful of rest is better than 2 fists full of labor and striving after the wind." So in those 2 verses, he uses all 3 words that is in Hebrew for the word hand, or referring to your arm. So the first one that he uses, and now on reflection, I wish I had put the verse along with it, but in verse 5, when he says the fool folds his hands in embrace, is talking about the word yad, which is like the forearm right here. So if I'm folding my yad, what does that mean? Like, what am I doing? I guess I'm not doing anything. I'm resting. I'm napping. I'm just giving up, kind of just folding my arms this way. The fool does this. The fool folds his hands, and he says consumes his own flesh. It's like self-destructive is what laziness is what not doing anything is. It's like you'll destroy yourself that way. And then the second one the last one that uses is the word hofen. You got to kind of clear your throat at the beginning. And that's where he says, better is 2 fistful of labor, and better than 2 fistful of labor and striving after the wind. So we had the folding of our yad, and now the word hofen is about like a closed fist. So I've got 2 fists that are just grasping after that smoke, grasping after that fleeting thing. But then he says, what's the middle one? What's the middle way between those 2 options? Because that's like going at it constantly, or you're just resolved to just laziness and sitting. But what's the middle one? He says, verse 6, he says, one hand full of rest. One hand full of rest. And that's the third option, is a kaf, which is what that was referring to, is kind of right here, this part of your hand, the open palm. So he's got 3 options for us here. You got yad, where you fold your arms and you shrug your shoulders, whatever. That'll destroy you. That eats your own flesh. You're self-destructive. Then you got the two fists, closed fists that are striving after and holding on to the wind, which is impossible. Or you've got the open palm, one open palm, full of rest. And so what's this middle way? You've got one hand right here that you're holding out. So where's my other hand? If one hand's right here and it's full of rest, what's my other hand doing? It's down by my side. Seems to be implied there. So I've got one hand in the game, and I'm working. I'm in the game. I'm in life. And my other hand is at rest. It's down here by my side. I've got one hand in the game and one hand resting. So I'm working. I'm doing life. I'm living, but from a place of restfulness and presentness. And the open hand says something truly beautiful. It says that God will give and take the right and wrong things. Because when my hand is open, I'm not clinging to anything. When my hand is open, it's both giving and receiving at the same time. I can put something in my hand, and there it is. Someone takes it away. I'm not clinging to it. It's just there. And what God does is the ultimate giver of the good and the bad. He knows what is good and what is bad. And it's not us seizing that like Adam and Eve did and taking on our own terms, but we have an open hand and we're receiving from him. And so he closes out the book in this way at the very end, because he talks about Again, the book closes the same way it opened. In chapter 12, verse 8 and through 14, he says, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Like that's exactly how we open, so it closes, hasn't changed. But he comes to a conclusion. He says, in addition to being a wise man, the preacher also taught the people knowledge. He pondered, searched out, and arranged many proverbs. The preacher sought to find delightful words and words of truth written uprightly. The words of the wise are like goads, and the master of these corrections are like well-driven nails. They're given by one shepherd. And that shepherd there in my Bible, and maybe in y'all's, but it's capitalized. The S is in the word shepherd. It's talking about the shepherd, talking about God. So these words of wisdom are like a sharp stick. That's what a goad is, to make an animal move a direction. It's like that's what these things are to us. They don't feel good. They're trying to get us to do something. They're trying to get us to move forward in a certain way. And he says, verse 13, the end of the matter and all that has been heard, fear God, keep his commandments, because this is the end of the matter for all mankind. For God will bring every work into judgment, everything which is hidden, whether good or evil. And so under the sun, everything is smoke, right? Everything's hevel, everything's grasping after the wind. But we have words that have come down from beyond the sun, from above. And those words of wisdom, those words of life, and the word of life that came down. Because if you will now turn over, and the lesson we'll wrap up here in just a moment. Because in Matthew chapter 11, think about that metaphor that we talked about of we're not folding our arms and resolved to just consume our own flesh. We're not grasping with both fists at the wind, but we have a hand at rest at our side and we have an open palm that's got one hand in the game, and we're working from a place of rest. Now listen to this one who came down, this word of life, this good shepherd, Jesus of Nazareth. He says in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28, he says, come to me, all you who are weary, heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. What's a yoke? Yoke is something that you carry. It's something that you put on an animal so it does work. But he says, take my yoke upon and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Because our Lord truly embodied that fully. When he says to God in the garden, when he prays to his Father, he says, not my will, but yours be done. It's full surrender to him. Because what Christ is he's that one who came from beyond everything under the sun, and he stepped out of the smoke, he stepped out of the hevel, and he invites us, he says, follow me. And he clears away the hevel of this life, everything that's smoke and meaningless, and under him, all these things that if we build our entire lives on them, these relationships, money, like careers, like future propositions, whatever you build on is going to eventually be taken away. But under him, they're gifts. They're things we can truly actually appreciate when we bring them under the yoke and the guidance of the Good Shepherd, the one who clears away the smoke of life. And so, if there's anyone here this evening, we're going to sing a song, and perhaps you've had a heavy burden, and you still feel that heavy yoke. Well, we have a Good Shepherd, and we have the one who came down and showed us the way, and he invites you to follow him.